Greetings, everyone, and thank you for joining us for this special members-only Scholar Sessions program. Your support helps President Lincoln's Cottage save Lincoln's beloved home and fulfill our mission to reveal the true Lincoln and continue the fight for freedom. We are joined today by Harold Holzer and Brian Lamb to discuss Harold's latest book, The Presidents versus the Press, The Endless Battle Between the White House and the Media, From the Founding Fathers to Fake News. Harold Holzer is the recipient of the 2015 Gilder-Lehrman Lincoln Prize, one of the country's leading authorities on Abraham Lincoln and the political culture of the Civil War era. Holzer was appointed chairman of the U.S. Abraham Lincoln Bicentennial Commission by President Bill Clinton and awarded the National Humanities Medal by President George W. Bush. He is the author, co-author, or editor of dozens of books on Lincoln and the Civil War, and has also published numerous monographs, hundreds of articles in scholarly and popular magazines, and introductions to another 50 volumes. He lectures throughout the country, appears regularly on national television, and serves on the advisory boards of a number of Lincoln-related institutions, including President Lincoln's Cottage, and he's chairman of the Lincoln Forum. Holzer currently serves as the director of the Roosevelt House Public Policy Institute at Hunter College, City University of New York. Brian Lamb is a journalist and the founder, executive chairman, and now retired CEO of C-SPAN. Prior to launching C-SPAN in 1979, Lamb held various communication roles, including White House telecommunications policy staffer and Washington bureau chief for Cablevision magazine. He also served as a commissioned officer in the United States Navy for 4 years. Lamb has conducted thousands of interviews, including those on C-SPAN's book notes and Q&A. Over the course of his career, Lamb has received numerous honors and awards, including the Presidential Medal of Freedom and the National Humanities Medal. Thank you all for joining us tonight, and Harold and Brian, I turn it over to you.
Thank you, Erin, and good evening, everybody. I have to just point out to the audience that I first met Harold on August the 22nd of 1993 when he sat down for a book notes interview. And fortunately or unfortunately for Harold, I've interviewed him hundreds of hours since then. So I'm looking forward to learning something else, as we usually always do with Harold. Harold, let me start by jumping right into the middle of your book and reading back to you what you wrote, and basically to ask you what impact you think this particular moment in our history had on journalism. You say, at age 70, nearly 60 years after the fact, I can still vividly recall feigning a cold as an 11-year-old so I could remain home from school on January the 20th, 1961 to watch the Kennedy inauguration moment by moment on a small black and white television. Rather than me reading the rest of it, continue that story.
Well, I wanted to see it moment to moment. I was besotted with John Kennedy, I must say, and wore a Kennedy button to school for 3 or 4 months. And I wanted to see the culmination of my private campaign in 6th grade, I guess. So yeah, I stayed home from school, pretended to be sick, and watched the departure from the White House, Eisenhower and Kennedy riding to the Capitol, the most memorable, well, the inaugural address, of course, but Robert Frost trying to read a poem, and watching the lectern start to smoke. Do you remember that, Brian? And so
I sure do, yes.
Yeah, so it just enhanced my interest in government and politics and communication. So I think it was a moment for me. But fortunately, my parents were gullible enough to let me get away with it.
The next couple lines are important to this story, which most people watching probably remember. 2.5 years later, my family and I huddled together, dazed but transfixed by the unfolding footage from Dallas, Washington, and Arlington, witness to a secular canonization by the media. Obviously, because this book is about the press. Talk about that experience, and what do you mean by the secular canonization by the media?
Well, as with the assassination of Lincoln, which I later studied so deeply and wrote about all of the bitterness and partisanship being forgotten in April 1865, when Lincoln was martyred down at Ford's Theater. Um, Kennedy was also a partisan figure. He was in Texas to fight for those electoral votes in an anticipated election with Barry Goldwater, and who turned out to be the Republican candidate. So within 12 hours, he was a universally beloved, internationally beloved public figure, with the world's leaders walking across the bridge to Arlington, his little boy saluting him. Unforgettable images that are burnished into public memory. It was just on television, and Kennedy. It was appropriate because Kennedy had been the first television president, really the first president to use television to, in a way, get around the media and bring his message directly to the American people.
How old were you when Jack Kennedy was shot?
I was 14.
Watching us tonight is your grandson, who I believe is 12?
13.
13. Has he bar mitzvahed yet?
He was. I'm wearing his bar mitzvah tie, the bar mitzvah tie we all wore.
The reason I bring him up is because what do you think when he's your age, he will think of the media as he's watching today's activities?
Well, I don't want to get into trouble, but Charles, who is very good at speaking for himself, he's interested in a much older form of communication, theater, and he has his own podcast in which he interviews Broadway veterans like Joel Grey and others. So Brian, he's more like you. He's a specialist in questioning and following his own track. I'm very proud of him.
But what I'm getting at is, you can add to this. You said that the media idolized Kennedy back in those days, and clearly today the media does not love our president, right, except for different segments of it and all that. What's the difference, and in the end, what is journalism?
Well, let me just push back on one assumption, if I may, and that is, from my research, I don't think that the media particularly loved Kennedy as an entity. I think he had, unlike Donald Trump, he had a lot of pals in the media. Kennedy had been a journalist after World War II. He covered post-war Europe, so he was one of them. So he had friends. He certainly leaked to journalists. He golfed with journalists. But there were plenty of reporters who pushed back against the secrecy of the Bay of Pigs, and indeed against the secrecy involved in the Cuban Missile Crisis. And Kennedy was rough about the right of the press to information. In fact, I got the title of my book from a Kennedy speech. I was going to call the book The Presidents and the Press, but Kennedy gave a speech to the National Publishers Association in New York right after the Bay of Pigs fiasco, in which he blamed the press for being too inquisitive and said directly, I was going to call this speech The Presidents and versus the Press. And that's really what I should call it, because you have a higher responsibility to the country than you do to the freedom to communicate. So now I've forgotten the second part of your question, but I do think he was not beloved by all of them. And they also resented the press conferences. One journalist said, watching him doing press conferences is like watching someone making love at Carnegie Hall. Think about that for a minute. And remember, a lot of the journalists were keeping his secrets as well. So they felt he owed them a little more access and information. So it was a kind of a fraught relationship with Kennedy, as it always is.
But put this in perspective for us. If you turn on CNN and MSNBC, if you pick up the New York Times and the Washington Post, they're just as apt to tell you early in any story, the President of the United States is lying to us.
Mhm.
How often in history has that kind of press been active?
Well, I would say it is part of maybe not a time-honored, but a long-time American tradition that began in the fourth year of George Washington's first term. And Washington was shocked that he was being criticized and attacked for such things as stealing from the Treasury, padding his expense accounts. Here, we just got through a weekend where President Trump was criticized for gallivanting around Walter Reed in an SUV.
Yeah, yes, good.
Washington was criticized for going about town in an ostentatious carriage, wasting time and money, gallivanting around Philadelphia, not Washington. So what's old is new again. The press was extremely partisan, extremely critical. It's not so much a comparison between MSNBC and Fox. We had that there were two newspapers in every major and minor American city. One adherent and loyal to one political party, the other to another political party. And the news was not only filtered through party loyalty, the newspapers were part of political machines. They were integral parts of the election campaigns, of the operations, and they got rewards openly. They got to work in the White House. They got printing contracts for their newspapers. They got to print the congressional record, which was not done by the government in those days.
We first met over the Lincoln-Douglas debates. You wrote a book, and this seems to be a good example of what you're talking about. Tell us how you got to the idea of doing the particular kind of Lincoln-Douglas debate book that you did.
Wow, this is a flashback to 1993. I have to just say, Brian Lamb asked me a question at that first interview. He said, do you think people would sit still today for 3-hour outdoor debates? And I said, no, the national attention span is too small. And he said, you're wrong, and I'll prove it to you. And my lack of faith was the inspiration for C-SPAN's recreation of all 7 Lincoln-Douglas debates, 21 hours of programming, plus the preludes and postludes, maybe 40 hours of programming, and just a fabulous moment in time. Anyway, yeah, the Lincoln-Douglas debates, which we talked about in '93, were covered by stenographers for the first time. So they made transcripts which were published in the papers. And I knew at that time that there were 2 versions of the debates, one published in the Democratic papers as transcribed by a Democratic Party hireling, the other in the Republican papers done by a Republican stenographer. And we had always used the approved version of each party because that's what Lincoln published in a book. So I thought it would be interesting to look at the Democratic version of Lincoln and the Republican version of Stephen Douglas to see what the unfiltered, unedited versions looked like. And they looked much more raw, unpolished. And so that was my idea.
It seems to me that Charleston debate and the moment when Abraham Lincoln talked about Black folks is a very important turn in history. And you can put it in perspective much better than I can, but how did each paper cover that particular moment?
And you're right, and we've heard about it in the New York Times 1619 project, and we've heard about it from folks who want to take down the Emancipation Group in Washington, D.C., the statue. Yeah, Lincoln said, I don't want to make jurors or voters of Black people. If one race is to have the superior position, I would prefer it to be the white race. What's forgotten are 2 things. One, he ended by saying, that doesn't mean that Black people should not eat the bread that they earn with their own hands. And just because I may not want an African-American woman for a wife does not mean I should want her for a slave. The other thing that's forgotten is, and this is subtler, at the beginning of these comments, and why did he make them? He made them because Stephen A. Douglas had accused him of favoring, horrors, racial integration and equality. And that was about as radical a concept among Illinois white male voters as you can imagine. And he begins this, he has to fight it back or he's an automatic loser in that race. And he fights back by saying, some of you may have heard that Judge Douglas accuses me of believing in the perfect equality of the races. And what both newspapers record at that moment is laughter. So in other words, the crowd in Charleston did not believe that such a far out concept had really come from the lips of Abraham Lincoln. So all of this just requires us, it doesn't require, but it suggests that it would do well for us to not have a 21st century purity test on people who lived in the 19th century.
Was there a difference between the way the two papers covered that particular moment?
No, I think they both covered it the same, but I'll give you another example from the first debate in Ottawa that illustrates our point. After the first debate, the Republican press wrote, following the event, Lincoln's supporters carried him on their shoulders in triumph off the platform. The Democratic press wrote, after the debate, Lincoln was so exhausted that his supporters had to carry him off the platform. That illustrates the different kinds of reports.
Define what a journalist is.
Now or then?
And let me expand on it. Not only what a journalist is, but what is journalism?
Journalism is the quest for truth and the transmittal of truth to the public. But that, I think, is more a 20th century definition. In the 19th century, maybe a bit in the 21st century, it's the filtering of events through the alembic of philosophical and political belief, and a quest to shape the events of the day to alter political outcomes. That's a much more cynical view. That was certainly the 19th century view. And one can say that on most cable news, there is an obvious bias. It's just that MSNBC and Fox don't say we are respectively the Democratic broadcasting system and the Republican broadcasting system. Whereas in 1851, Henry J. Raymond started the New York Times and issued a pamphlet saying, we will be a Republican Party newspaper.
So what do you do when you want to find the truth?
I listen to C-SPAN. I listen to it and analyze it for myself. By the way, I should tell our viewers that Brian Lamb is not only the interlocutor today, he is actually a character in my book, because he figures in my Ronald Reagan chapter and my Barack Obama chapter. So if anyone thinks they know Brian Lamb, I invite you to go back and look. I won't embarrass him and talk about it tonight, but they were really interesting vignettes I was able to, or not able to, I dared to report. So I think you go there. And I think you find a newspaper that you believe is fair. But again, newspapers are here in New York. If we read the New York Times, we certainly get a progressive view of the news. And if we read the New York Post, we get a conservative view of the news. So newspapers are changing too. And I don't know what the answer is, except, I will say, before the pandemic, I did a couple of college visits. And I would always ask a class, Brian, I learned this from you, where do you get your news? And I was really shocked at what I heard. And there were always adult learners, older adult learners in the group. The adult learners always said the Wall Street Journal. It was interesting. And this is not in New York, it's everywhere. The younger ones said everything from Breitbart to the Agence France Presse News in English. That was the most astonishing answer I ever got, because they or BBC, they don't believe American sources can give them straight news. And it's sort of sad in a way.
Going back to your book, and this is book 54. Are you working on another one?
I'm not, I should be, but I'm not. I owe Lincoln and immigration. So that'll be a few years down the road.
Where I was going is that only 18 of the 44 men who've been president do you feature in your book, if I count right. But I want to ask you, though, you don't include Eisenhower, who was rather successful. Why not?
Well, it got to the point where I had to be selective. And of course, my wise guy answer is I didn't think anyone would want to read about Zachary Taylor in the press or Warren Harding in the press. What I did with the more interesting ones, who I didn't cover with full chapters, and only because I thought it might be overload, I wanted to do the revolutionaries of the 20th century in media relations, by whom I mean Theodore Roosevelt, Woodrow Wilson, FDR, and Kennedy. And then I thought, you know, after Kennedy, I should do everyone. But with some presidents, I put them into other chapters. So I put Truman and Eisenhower. Eisenhower, after all, did the first live televised press conference. It wasn't terribly successful. I put Truman in that chapter because of the great story of his reaction when his daughter did a concert in Washington that was panned by a music critic, and Truman wrote a now immortal letter saying, "If I ever see you again, you will need a piece of raw meat for your eye and a supporter below." And that story was published in the Washington Press. But what I found out is one of the reasons he was so agitated that day is that his press secretary, who was a practical joker, had put his head on his desk that morning, and it wasn't a joke. He was dead at his desk. And Truman was really bereft, upset, and probably wouldn't have done it had he had a press secretary that night or the next morning. So I thought that was a good story. So, and I put John Quincy Adams in the Jackson chapter, et cetera, et cetera.
I'm a little disappointed that you threw Harding under the bus. And the new book out by Eleanor Herman called Sex with Presidents, he's prominent.
Well, unless they're having sex with journalists, I really didn't think it was appropriate for my book. By the way, I do mention that that was the only election between two newspaper men. So I thought that was worth. Cox and Harding, not only were they both newspaper men, they both were from Ohio, and they had newspapers that weren't that many miles apart. Brian, please don't ask me any geographical questions, but one was Marion, Ohio, right? I don't remember where the other one was.
Well,
Dayton,
it was Dayton, and the reason I know is because the chairman of C-SPAN right now is the head of Cox Cable, which is named after James Cox, who started the company with the Dayton Daily News. Anyway, all right, back to this question about the book. You don't talk about Garfield or McKinley, and I want to ask you why they were both murdered. Why do they not get the kind of coverage that a Kennedy or a Lincoln have gotten after they were martyred?
So I think there is evidence that they did get that kind of coverage. Like Lincoln, both of them inspired display images for the home in which they were depicted as martyrs. The difference was that when Garfield died, he was portrayed with Lincoln, and when McKinley died, there were triple portraits of Lincoln, Garfield, and McKinley. So it was also a transformative time in visual communication. McKinley was president on the cusp of well, he was in the middle of the yellow journalism era, but people were not buying separate sheet display images in the way that they had in the Civil War era.
Another joint presidential question. The president before Abraham Lincoln, Buchanan, and the president after him, Johnson, you don't talk about them much. What kind of press did they get on either
this is
side?
It's very glasses half empty line of questioning, I must say. But that's
yes, okay. and you deserve every minute of it. But why? You know, and basically, what kind of press did either one of them get on either side of Abraham Lincoln?
Well, Buchanan got celebratory press from the Democratic newspapers and withering attacks from the Republican press, which was just starting to be in formation in the year of Buchanan's election. So he sort of escaped a lot of the criticism in his early days, and his early days were the Dred Scott decision. So obviously that riled up the Republican press against him, and it never forgot what they considered an injustice and what Lincoln and the Republican press considered a national conspiracy among the executive, the congressional, and the judicial branches of government, that there was a conspiracy to nationalize slavery. So that's the kind of press Buchanan got. Johnson's press was very interesting. And now, actually, this is the first time that I felt guilty about not including something in the book. Well, actually, at least the first thing you've said that's made me feel guilty. Johnson received a rather surprising press in the North from the Republican press, some suggesting that his firm hand was necessary because Lincoln would inevitably have been too forgiving to treat the white South in the manner that it deserved to be treated. Within months, they discovered that Johnson's was extremely lenient toward the white rebel class, and was insensitive and blind to the needs of the African Americans in the South. But in the beginning, Johnson got good press from the Republicans and forgiving press. I mean, there have been, one of the most interesting concepts that I try to treat on and off throughout the book is this concept of press honeymoons and how long they last. Johnson had a honeymoon from the press, Democratic and Republican, in the beginning. John Adams had a honeymoon press from the Republican Democratic newspapers for a while, because they were relieved that he wasn't George Washington. And then they turned on him eventually. And then he turned on them, as I write.
You've got quite a big bibliography about what you read in order to get this book together. I want to ask you, and this is not fair, you don't know I'm going to ask you this, but could you name, I don't care how many, 3, 4, 5 books that you would recommend to your grandson Charles to read as he begins his education about presidents, where people you thought were fantastic writers, and they were. Go ahead.
Not about the press, just about presidents, right?
Yeah, basically about presidents. Yeah.
Well, David McCulloch's book about John Adams, John Meacham's book about Andrew Jackson, Bob Caro's books about Lyndon Johnson, Theodore H. White's books about the elections of 1960, 1964, and 1968. Those aren't exactly about presidents. I think that's a good start, no?
I've asked you this before, and I actually have the book behind me, and I don't know if you're going to say the same thing. What would you say is the best, other than all the books you've written about Lincoln, what's the best single book about Abraham Lincoln's life?
You know, I have very strange taste. My favorite Lincoln book for a long, long time was a book called Lincoln, A Picture Story of His Life, by a Hungarian-born writer named Stefan Laurent. I had this idea of Lincoln images in my mind from the time I was 12 or 13 years old. And that book, which sounds like a children's book, but is based on Lincoln's photographs and a chronology of Lincoln's photographs. And as many of the Lincoln Cottage audience may know, there's been quite a recent controversy about a Lincoln photograph that was highlighted on a television documentary on Sunday night. I still recommend that if it can be found. But really, David Donald's one-volume book is just wonderful as a cradle to grave. And I think, and I told him this once, I don't agree with the epigraph of the book, which uses Lincoln's quote, I do not claim to control events. I think events have controlled me. And when I reviewed the book in the Chicago Tribune, I said, it's the best book ever written about Lincoln around a flawed theme.
But the book that you told me was the best single volume was before the Lincoln book by David Herbert Donald, Benjamin Thomas. How does that stand? How does that stand up to it?
Ben Thomas was a wonderful, wonderful writer. The problem with Thomas is that he doesn't have any source notes. And I don't know why he decided not to do that, but not only has it injured his reputation, or it's the reputation of the book, but it's caused all sorts of problems as people have had this 20-year-long controversy about plagiarism. Did people plagiarize Thomas? Did Thomas plagiarize somebody else? And it's a mess. And I think Thomas would have saved us a great deal of heartache if he had used sources. But one chapter that I'd say is maybe the best chapter ever written about Lincoln was Thomas's chapter about the Lincoln White House and the operations, the routine in the Lincoln White House, with a lot about the Soldiers' Home, I think, as I recall.
Aaron, I'm quite willing to give up this exciting opportunity to interview Harold. For if folks have already got questions, and you can, anytime you want to, take it away, because I know people that are, this group that's watching are obviously Harold fans, and they ought to be able to have at him if they want.
Yeah, if you all could, and we missed that instruction in the beginning, the chat is open. And so if you have a question, please go ahead and put that in the chat now, and then we can read your question out, or if you'd prefer to use your voice, we can make sure that you're unmuted. The only comment we have right now in there is from Jack, who noted, as someone about 6 months older than Harold, I seem to remember that the New York City schools were closed on January 20th, 1960 because of a snowstorm, and that's why he was able to watch the Kennedy inauguration.
Is this Jack Billig? He looks a lot younger than I do. I'm not too happy about that. So no, they weren't. I think Washington had a much worse snowstorm, Jack. Washington had the real snowstorm. New York, I definitely had to feign illness because I spent the whole day in my bed. I wouldn't have done that if I didn't have to keep up the charade.
Aaron, do you have another question standing by, or should I ask?
No, we're still waiting for others to write theirs in. So go ahead and keep going, Brian.
And I thought I'd survived another Brian Lamb inquiry.
Harold, I have always wanted to ask you this. How do you, as someone who can't even come close to doing what you do, how do you remember all the stuff that you remember? You can quote off the top of your head things that Lincoln said back in 1963 on January the 4th. How do you do it?
I've been doing it for 50 years, so I think that's how I do it. Now I'm worried about retaining it, I suppose. But I don't know. I keep reading. I make notes. I don't have a computer file, I must say, but I have great files and notes. Lincoln quotes just stick in my mind. I'm not as conversant with the other presidents, which is why I enjoyed this project so much, going back in time and ahead in time, and writing about more current people, even interviewing one president for the book. So you're much too kind is my shorthand answer. I still have to use the library here to to check my sources very carefully. And I'm very happy that, I guess one of the things I'm happy about with this book is that I've heard from readers who have caught little things in the book that I should have caught myself. So I'm definitely not an expert on everybody. I think I know enough about the press to have written the book, but I'm grateful for the feedback, for sure.
Aaron?
I was wondering if I could go ahead and jump in and ask a question too, and then we have a couple things that it looks like are coming in as well. You had mentioned that Kennedy was able to leapfrog the press a little bit by using the medium of television, and FDR did that as well with radio. Can you speak a little bit more about the history of sort of jumping over the press to get your message out directly, but then also the layers of filters between the president and the press that we have now that didn't exist in the first few administrations in this country, that those layers of secretaries and other staff that are essentially public affairs and PR people who are speaking on behalf of the president, that to some extent add layers of separation between the president and the press.
You have a few questions in there, but there's certainly layers of separation now. But if you have a president who wants to engage the press, like Donald Trump does, he rarely, only when he's, I'm surprised he didn't go over to the press last night when he came home from the hospital. He does like bantering and scrumming with journalists, so he's available a lot. Some journalists wish he wasn't as available, especially now. So it also depends on personal preference. But to get back to your original question, the sub-theme of the book, it's not only the fact that the back and forth and the non-friendliness is part of American presidential and press tradition, but that indeed the presidents who have been most successful are those who, I like your leapfrogging metaphor. Lincoln, for sure, realized early that the telegraph was available to take his personal letters to people and send them across the country so they could be published in the press at the same time. He also spent the last month of the Civil War, practically all of it at the front, and was filing dispatches back through the telegraph on his observations, which were then printed in the newspaper. So he was not only commander-in-chief, but communicator-in-chief at the end of the war. Although he missed Appomattox, he came home a little too soon. Definitely FDR and the radio. He did also, though, hold 998 press conferences and only 28 fireside chats. But those of us who are old enough, like Jack and me, to have had parents who lived through the New Deal, they would tell you that Roosevelt was on the air all the time. Like Jack Benny, he was on constantly on the radio because the fireside chats were so impactful. Kennedy with televised news conferences, for sure. Barack Obama with the first White House website, for better or for worse. I think the most surprising thing about my research into what journalists have left behind as reminiscences or memoirs or articles is that the press was really not too happy with the way the Obama administration treated them in terms of access, in terms of cracking down on leaks and stories, wiretapping reporters, but also referring them to the White House website. And finally, Donald Trump, who is a genius in one particular mode of communication, the tweet. Now last few days, they've been Twitter feeds with videos. Just even before the COVID crisis, even before the campaign, and here, Brian, this is a part that I was a little bit critical of the press about. Donald Trump would do a tweet in the morning, and for the next 7 hours, all of cable news, that is MSNBC, CNN, and Fox, would be devoted to analyzing and reanalyzing his tweet. He was setting the agenda with a Twitter feed every morning. And I think that's too much abrogation of responsibility. But you have to credit Trump with and I found the first tweet that he ever issued as a businessman. Tune in to Letterman tonight as I do my top 10 list. That was his first tweet.
We actually have a related question coming in from Charles for you, Harold. Charles, would you like to ask your question with your voice, or shall I read it from the text?
I can ask it with my voice. So I wanted to know, how was it a challenge to write about the ever updating relationship between Trump and the press?
That's a great question, Charles. I wish you'd asked it in private, but that's okay. It was a real challenge because when you're writing about a president who is serving, the book is going to be outdated no matter what. And this book did not anticipate a pandemic, obviously. So it's out of date because it ends before the pandemic. So I actually got a second chance at updating because I begged my publisher for a chance to write a couple of final paragraphs in the Trump chapter because so much had happened between the stage of unbound galleys and galleys. For those of you who've written books, and I see Candy Hooper is on the phone, she knows what I'm talking about. When you send a book in, you get pages and then you get a bound galley, and that's the last minute you can correct, and you can't go in longer than any page exists. So I got a few extra paragraphs, but I ended it almost with ellipses at the end, as if to reaffirm that this is a work in progress and there's no way to have a final moment.
Peggy says, have you read the Mallard bio on Garfield? It's one of the best presidential books I've ever read. Peggy, is there anything you wanted to say about why you enjoyed it so much?
I had to unmute myself. Well, yes, because I had no idea Garfield was such an incredible, intelligent, ethical human being. And what I learned from it was that the bullet that he took, had it been left alone by the medical authorities at that time, it was a superficial wound. He would have lived and had no trouble at all. But the doctors of the time, who all wanted to be important people, start sticking their dirty fingers into his wound, and he eventually got sepsis and died. But he was absolutely brilliant and drawn into the presidency against his better judgment, and is one of the many people who in his idle time developed an alternative proof of the Pythagorean theorem.
That's a good recollection. The same way that that Lincoln was interested in mathematics, and Garfield, of course, was one of that generation of presidents that sort of proved their eligibility for office through their Civil War records. And Garfield had a notable record in the Civil War as well. That is a good book, Peggy. You're absolutely right.
Chris also has a question about books. Chris's question is there a book on Lincoln that has greater impact on you now than when you first read it?
Yeah, Carl Sandburg. I read it, all 4 volumes, when I was young. I loved it. It's beautifully, beautifully written. Sandburg, who's from Galesburg, Illinois, and knew people of the Lincoln era when he was a boy, Civil War soldiers and such, veterans, had the cadence of the Illinois prairie in his prose and poetry. But when I started writing, in the period I started writing my own books in the 80s, Sandburg was very much considered outdated, fanciful, undependable. And in rereading Sandburg and having mastered or better mastered the Lincoln literature, I realized that he took very few bad turns. All of his work is based on very deep research. It's just that he, like Benjamin Thomas, just decided not to give sources, which makes it hard to follow him. But I don't think anyone has ever written the Lincoln story with a better ear than Carl Sandburg. So I came to reappreciate him.
Excellent. We also have a question from Lynn. Lynn, would you like to ask your question with your voice?
Hello, Harold. It's actually Seth. How are you?
Okay.
Sorry about that, Seth.
How are you doing?
I'm good. So aside from the gotcha story of Washington and his carriage in Philadelphia, when would you say investigative reporting of the presidency began?
Well, you know, I think partisan journalism meant that there weren't really investigations. There was praise and there were complaints. And that was followed by beginning with McKinley and mostly with TR, kind of what I called front page journalism, where characters like Roosevelt and even Woodrow Wilson wanted to be on, you know, at the top of the news every day. Does that sound familiar? I mean, the kind of investigative journalism that we're talking about started, I guess, with Johnson, and reached the apex with Nixon when the press was emboldened by the fact that it could help take down a president of the United States. But looking back at Johnson, that was the beginning of the credibility gap, as it was described. Originally just a parody of the budget gap, because the first disagreement was about budget projections, about the debt, would you believe it? The budget and the debt. And the press began doubting everything that Johnson was saying, investigated personal things like, was Lyndon Johnson carrying a beer in his car when he drove 90 miles an hour in Texas? Is he intimidating Marvin Kalb and Bernard Kalb? He's calling up journalists, he's calling up newspaper network presidents and telling them to get their reporters off his back. So he opened up this wide gap in trust, so that everything from the seizure of a United States ship in Korea to, of course, the war was being doubted. And I think that's where I would date it to. Brian might disagree, but that's where I dated to Johnson, at least the current style of investigative journalism. And I must say, isn't it amazing that Bob Woodward was part of the team that went after Watergate so relentlessly, and 50 years later, he's still at it, the same Bob Woodward? That's amazing. Of course, now he does it by phoning the president and saying, speak, I'm taping, and the president does. So it's a little easier for him.
This is a really powerful and interesting question from Fred. Fred asks, when does history become history? As opposed to, I imagine Fred means the news.
Boy, that is a deep and provocative question. I would say, this is just my opinion off the top of my head, is that where presidential administrations are concerned, they become history when the administration ends. And history, you know, as Edwin Stanton said of Lincoln, now he belongs to the ages because he died. When an administration ends, it is left not just to the journalists, but to the historians to analyze what the journalists have written.
We also have a question from someone whose Zoom name is DLC. DLC, did you want to ask your question with your voice?
No, go ahead. You can just read it.
Absolutely. So DLC says, the remarks on journalists by century are spot on. There's a fundamental difference between journalists and rank reporters who cannot avoid having an opinionated cast on virtually every question. But aside from the true investigative muckrakers like Ida B. Wells, Lincoln Steffens, Ida Tarbell, couldn't one argue that even in the last century, television media like Walter Cronkite were so adamantly opposed to not just Vietnam, but LBJ personally, that their reporting was painfully skewed? And then they add, you have beat me to this with the Johnson comments. So,
well, Johnson would agree with you. He believed that he never got a fair shake from the journalists because they were an Eastern elite establishment that was so enamored of John Kennedy that they they found his assent unforgivable. It's not that Johnson didn't try. He tried to hold more press conferences than Kennedy. He did them in every location, in the White House, on the grounds, in the map room, he took reporters on nude swimming excursions, which they didn't really want to do, and gave them drinks. But he also bullied them, or gave them the silent treatment. So yeah, there was that. Now I've forgotten what the DLC's question was. It was very good. Here I am rambling. Joan,
It was just this bias against LBJ, and I think you kind of hit what I was getting at. Is I'm a born and raised Chicagoan who went to journalism school at Iowa and then PhD at the University of Chicago, and my entire 36-year diplomatic career, there was always this push-pull of Eastern and Western elites, and you fly over people.
Yeah.
So much so. And I forgive me, I have to say this, and I think Mr. Lamb will appreciate this, is I went to a thing with a number of Obama officials one evening, and this woman started castigating stupid people in Iowa. And I raised my hand and I looked at her and I said, "You do realize it is the most literate state in the country, right?" And she had no idea. She said, "It is." And I said, "Yes, about 20% higher than New York." And that ended that conversation. But I just throw that out there because I think maybe that was part of that dynamic.
You know, Kennedy and Kennedy's class and caste and wealth and looks and charm, you know, just bowled over a lot of journalists. But he didn't have a completely free ride, as I point out in the book. Johnson had bullied the press for years as Senate Majority Leader. There are some stories that I have put in the book about not defending longtime friends in journalism who were thrown into the McCarthy maelstrom of investigations and blacklisting. So you know, so in a way there was some vengeance there. It was not just elitism and East versus West, North versus South. Johnson brought a lot of it on himself by being both obnoxious and being gross sometimes, I must say.
We have another question from Fred, who says, you mentioned Stanton, who went to Kenyon College in Ohio with 5 others from Lincoln's associates. Is there a single Lincoln associate you value the most for reading?
Well, Stanton is interesting. I think Lincoln was closest to Seward, his Secretary of State, who had been the favorite to win the Republican nomination in the year Lincoln won. And almost by tradition, and I say this with all due respect to my friend Doris Kearns Goodwin, it was the tradition of the day that the person who was going to get the nomination but didn't and was really well known got to be Secretary of State, as opposed to choosing your rivals in some great act of benevolence. But Seward and he were opposites, and Seward tried to almost organize a coup d'etat in the days between Sumter and Bull Run, which Lincoln put down very deftly by writing a memo, and I think not showing it to Seward, but not giving it to him, but showing it to him. And from that moment on, Seward was unbreakably loyal to Lincoln, and they were very devoted. Whenever Lincoln came back from one of his trips to the front, he would make a beeline across Lafayette Park to not carrying a Bible, but walking over to talk to William Seward at his home in Lafayette Square. So I like to read everything about Seward, including the stuff that Gideon Wells wrote, not so friendly, and his son's wonderful biography, and Walter Starr's wonderful biography as well.
I'm actually going to sneak a question of my own in here at the end, which is what I've heard from you so far, Harold, in the discussion is that there has been a long and contentious history between many US presidents and the press. And yet still many people have a feeling that now the present is a new and different level. So if it is not in fact new, why do you think it feels new to so many folks?
I think it feels new, and I don't think it's new. I think it's, again, goes back to a longstanding, if, contentious American tradition. I think it feels new because of the ubiquity of it. It doesn't happen every week. It happens 4 times a day. You don't read it the next morning when you're trying to digest your breakfast. You see it on television 24/7. You can watch it live unfolding on C-SPAN, or you can watch people conversing and fighting. You can, watch Sean Hannity or Chris Cuomo or anybody you want to go over it at the same moment and flip the dials. So it's constant. It's constant now. That's why I think it feels different. And also we have a president who revels in it, who loves doing it.
Harold, I have we're getting near the end. I have a question about historians. I know you weren't involved in this, but I'd be interested in knowing what you think or thought of the historians, and it was organized by David McCullough and Ken Burns, and a lot of historians who went on YouTube before the campaign ended in 2016 and took a very strong anti-Trump position. What do you think that does to the ability of historians to look back and have some kind of a detached approach to the whole history of Donald Trump?
So I was on that letter too, which you've conveniently forgotten, so I have to be honest about it.
I'm really talking about the video that was on YouTube more than anything. There's a whole series of, and I don't know how many, I've used it in a couple of interviews.
I think I did one too. I don't know what's more horrifying, that we all did it or that you forgot that I did it, but that's okay. I think it's a historian's right to see parallels, to see warning signs. That's what we're supposed to do, not just write nostalgically about the past, but use the lessons of the past to inform the present and make a better future.
Great. Thank you so much.
Erin,
Yeah.
could I ask a quick question of all the faces I've seen? Because I've done nothing in the last 3 days but do answers on Facebook and email about the documentary about the Lincoln deathbed photograph. Did
Yes.
anybody out there see it, the Discovery Channel show? I'm sort of relieved. There is a new, supposedly, deathbed photograph of Lincoln. You can all Google it and just see it, which is so historically wrong. I'm shocked that there was a 2-hour television special. But anyway, I guess I shouldn't have brought it up, but it's burning up the internet in a way that I haven't seen a Lincoln story burn up the internet in a long time.
Harold, are you really shocked that there was a 2-hour documentary about that?
Yeah, because I think, it's on its face, it's so absurd.
Well, I'm just talking about today, in today's age.
Oh.
That's what I'm getting at, is that, the kind of things that both the cable news channels will develop into a 4-day story versus a documentary about something like this.
I guess I see what you're saying. It's not surprising. I'm just amazed that somebody, I guess it's healthy that there's a history show that gets so much attention from, well, I guess from the Lincoln assassination crowd was mostly interested in it.
Yeah. Good. Thank you, Harold and Brian. This was a real treat tonight. And thanks to all of you for joining us and participating this evening. We really appreciate all your questions. We do have another scholar session in the works for the end of this month, so stay tuned for an announcement on that. And we also have our annual Lincoln Ideas Forum, which we normally hold in person in April, but we had to postpone it. And even with the postponement, we're going to hold it virtually. The theme is unchanged, though. We're still focusing on presidential character for our Lincoln Ideas Forum. And we'll have colleagues from different presidential museums and libraries joining us for the event. I think you'll all really enjoy it, so keep a lookout and sign up for that. So thank you all again. Harold, Brian, it's a pleasure as always, and we hope you all have a wonderful evening. Take care.
Thanks, Aaron. Good to be with you.
Thank you.